We are very privileged to have this afternoon to open this session Dr. Liane Saunders, the Strategy Director and Strategic Programs Coordinator. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd be so kind to take your seats. Thank you. Dr. Saunders took up her position after spending some time with the Foreign Service and also at the Prime Minister's National Security Council at number 10. We're very happy to have her with us this afternoon. Dr. Saunders, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you too to the IDC for inviting me. This is not only my first time at Herzliya, but it's my first time in Israel, and I'm very glad to be with you all today. Unlike the esteemed colleagues who are going to join you for the panel shortly, I am a serving diplomat, so I'm not a politician, and I'm not a leader in the political sense of the word. And so you'll appreciate that the comments that I make here today are ones that I make in my own right, me speaking personally, and they shouldn't be taken as representing what my government says. And that's an important point to make because I find as Director of Strategy that I spend a lot of my time looking forward. And inevitably, when we look forward, it is very difficult to predict what we might see. And with the title that we've been given for this session, nothing could be more clear than that we will get things wrong. So in a vain effort to try and start things with a bit more certainty, I thought we'd perhaps take a look at what we actually mean by a changing world order. And to do that, I first thought that we might look back 10 years and look at what we were thinking about in 2008. And in this week in 2008, Vladimir Putin had stood down from the presidency in Russia and was then nominated immediately for the prime ministership. At the same time, in this part of the world, there was a violent political dispute in the Lebanon. And of course, over in the transatlantic area, there was a presidential campaign that was playing out very slowly. But we were certain that we were going to see a very different sort of president in the White House at the end of 2008. But the thing that nobody was really focused on at that point in 2008 was the major financial crisis that would consume the world between 2008 and 2009. The crisis had actually started in 2007, but we just didn't know at that point in time where it was going to lead. Now, I make that reflection of what life was like 10 years ago because there is a tendency in foreign affairs and in defence and security policy for us always to imagine that it can't get any worse than it already has, and then it does. So I think it's worth, as we reflect what we look at today and think about in terms of an evolving world order, and I'd perhaps use that rather than a new world order as the phrase to describe what we're seeing, we need to look at what drives those changes. And many of the changes that we see in the way that we are regarding and interacting in the world today were forged in that crisis of 2008 and onwards. Because if I had to sum up 4 drivers for where we are today and where we are going, it would be demography, economy, technological change, and values, or as I would call it, dignity of humanity. And the reason that I've selected those is because a lot is changing, and it's changed over a longer period of time than we've noticed. So, for example, in the last 20 years, the number of countries in extreme poverty has halved. Nearly half the world now is made up of middle-income countries. And yet, 70% of the world's poor also live in middle-income countries. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on this planet will come from the African continent. Those dynamics of demographics are really, and economy, are really changing the way that we think about the world. Add into that the technological change that even by the end of this year, it is entirely possible that 1/3 of the world will own a smartphone and all that gives them access to, and that by 2024, it is quite likely that electric cars on a mile per gallon cost will be on a parity with the cost of driving a conventional diesel or petrol car. These sort of things start to make a difference to the people in all of our countries. And what is now very clear, in a way that it wasn't 10 years ago, is that while the benefits of globalization have been dispersed very evenly and widely, the deficits of globalization have found themselves very deeply positioned. And that has helped feed the sort of conflicts that we have seen grow in new parts of the world, including the sort of conflicts that we saw in the Arab Spring. But of course, they have also exacerbated those long-standing conflicts that we have seen for many years, again, in the Middle East and beyond. And they make people think differently about what they want. The sense of identity that people have is changing, because with the ability of a mobile phone, they can see more easily what other people have and what they do not. So migration is driven because people can see very clearly that there are places in the world that seem to offer an alternative, a better life, a better economic life, a better political life than whichever system they are under. And of course, there are those who want to express themselves, their religion, their sexuality, their identity in whatever way they choose to, in ways that do not meet the rules and regulations and laws of their countries. And so thinking about how people, individuals, behave in the world is something that sometimes, when those of us who are dealing with high politics and the politics of the nation state forget. And yet I would argue that there have been some successes in the way that the rules-based international system has dealt with issues that point to the whole health of the planet. And I think the way that the climate change agreements through Paris were developed is a very important example of that. Because what that particular set of agreements did was it brought together different communities. It brought together NGOs, it brought together industry with experts so that they could create something together. Now, of course, subsequently, we've seen President Trump say that America is going to withdraw from the agreement, but we've also seen the response to that from different cities, powerful cities, saying that they will respond differently. And I think it's important to remember, as we kind of look ahead to the world order of the 21st century, that cities, as well as states, will be very important in those calculations, because more people are going to be living in urban surroundings and many more people in mega cities over the next 50 years than has been the case to date. So we're confronted in this changing world order with issues to do with the governance of our countries and the relationships between our countries, with the effects of globalization, with the questions of legitimacy, not just the legitimacy of governments, but also the legitimacy of large corporations. And in particular here, after a long period of very low regulation on the internet and the social media side, we're now seeing what some have called the tech clash in terms of trying to place more controls on this area because people are uncomfortable about how their dignity, how their individual expression, how their countries are being affected by both malign state, hostile state actions and individual and commercial hacking. So where does that take us? Well, I think it's really important to recognize that when I said early on in my remarks that 1 in 4 people will come from an African nation by 2050, where the African sub-Saharan continent is now is much further ahead than China or South Korea or Japan, with their powerhouses of economy, were 50 years ago. And so the pace of change is moving ever faster. And so the question for us, and the question that I think the panel will look at, is how do we address that with the system that we have today? The system that we have had today has stood us in good stead since the end of the Second World War. And it's worth remembering that we are, of course, 100 years now from the end of the First World War. So in a century that saw 2 great world wars, 2 powerful, all-consuming, all-destructive world wars, it is now the case that even with recent conflicts, we have enjoyed more peacetime collectively across the globe, although I realize not necessarily in this part of the globe, than we have at any time previously. So the real question is, how do we maintain that in the years to come? And what do we need to do to our system to help us do so? So with that question hanging in the air, I will now turn over to my colleagues on the panel.